Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. If you're new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without any grow lights or humidifiers or a greenhouse. They're either inside or they're outside or they're out of the pool. So if that sounds like your environment, and if you're remotely curious, do hit subscribe and the notification bell because I do post every week. I'm a complete amateur, and the reason I started this channel was I found it quite hard to find information about orchids I could grow in my environment. So here we are. And today, look at this beauty. Oh my goodness, I am so excited to show this to you. All right, let us not keep you in suspense any longer. It is a Holcoglossum kimballianum. When I first saw this spike emerging, I just could not believe it or my luck. So it's taken forever to open, but I'm so excited. Here it is. It is open and just stunning. Look at those flowers. Couldn't you weep with joy? Well, I am. Anyway, plant lovers, let us start at the very beginning. Always a good place with Holcoglossum as a genus. I, of course, had never heard of this when I started growing orchids. It's just one of those things you stumble across. So let's put it in geographical context first of all. So Holcoglossum, which is the genus, isn't very big. I think there's about 20 species and they all center roughly around the same part of the world, which is Exhibit A, an enormous atlas. It is this part of Southeast Asia where China shares a border with Vietnam, Laos, Thailand and Myanmar. So some of the species are only found in one particular area, one particular country, and a lot of them are found in China particularly, and then some across the border. So that's sort of general neck of the woods. And as you might be able to see, that is fairly high elevation. But before we get into all of those details about care conditions, let's just think about the name for a second. Holcoglossum, which is quite a mouthful, comes from two Greek words, which mean holkos, which means a strap, and glossa, which means a tongue. So strappy tongue. Longbow once again. And kimballianum is named after a man called Mr. Kimball, who was a great orchid enthusiast at the turn of the century. Couldn't find anything about him, poor Mr. Kimball. But anyway, he's immortalized in this and a few other orchids. I noticed there's a Masdevallia called kimballianum as well. So he must have been someone of influence in the orchid world, I think, in the US. All right, so let's start by looking at the plant, and as you can see, it is basically monopedial. So it kind of, well, it's very related to the Vanda family and grows in that same way. The Holcoglossums have been crossed with Vandas to produce an intergeneric mega mix. But anyway, this is just stunning. So this is the species orchid, which is how you would find it in the wild. And imagine coming across that in the highlands of Southeast Asia. Your dreams would all come true. So yes, monopedial, as you can see, a very, very similar growth to Vandas, except the leaves are sort of a bit fleshier and a bit longer. But what that also means is, as you can see, no pseudobulb, which means certain things about care. But anyway, let us go back to the conditions. So most of these Holcoglossums occur in the same sort of geographic area, very high altitude. And what I have discovered is that often, not always, high altitude species orchids do very well in my climate, because the altitude, although they're sort of in a tropical area, the altitude obviously makes the winters colder and the nights cooler, but generally not freezing. And the summers are often very sunny, very bright. And then depending where they are, it's either monsoonal or not. So all sorts of different weather patterns, but a lot of cloudy humidity, dampness, and then a lot of summer, and in fact winter light. Of course, that's a massive generalization. Mountain climates are very different all over the world, but I always tend to try and find orchids that come from those higher altitudes because they do seem to work here in Melbourne and obviously in a cooler climate. Now, I knew nothing about growing this whatsoever, and I didn't even know that it was going to tolerate cooler temperatures. So I first bought this as a seedling, and in fact, actually the nursery is on the back. It's called Rosella Orchids, and I'll put the details of those guys below. And Rosella is a native parrot here in Australia. So I bought this in the early days of my orchid buying, early days of COVID, when I just had no idea, but I saw the flowers. I thought, that looks pretty. And here we are today. All right, we've set the scene. So they are largely epiphytes, but they can actually also live sort of in the nooks of rocks as well. So generally on things, whether it's more at ground level in a tree, on a rock, but we'll call it an epiphyte generally, which means many things. Firstly, free draining loose mix. So if you imagine in the wild, when it rains, the water runs past the plant, it takes up what it can, the leaf litter and the natural material around it will absorb a bit of water, but that will all dry out fairly quickly. Now, as it doesn't have a pseudobulb, you can presume that there is fairly constant rain or airborne moisture because of these aerial roots, like a vanda. So it's going to absorb lots of water from the atmosphere. In pot culture then, it means you've got to really keep your eye on it. So it is not an orchid to let dry out completely. So saying this is fairly tough. I'm perhaps not as religious in my watering as I should be, but you know what? Why don't I go and show you where this baby is living, and it'll give you more of a context of my growing conditions. Let's go outside. Okay, are you ready for a trip outside to see where this little baby is living? And it is out the back, living its best life over here, just up on the wall. Ta-da! So yes, there it is on the wall. So as you can see, there's a lattice work there, and I have got the pot just suspended in a little bit of a wire hoop, and it's hanging on the lattice. So that is south facing, so there's no direct sunlight. Up here we have polycarbonate roof, so it gets filtered light most of the day. And then over here is east facing, so the orchid gets quite good morning light, and then it gets quite diffused light for most of the day. And then sort of mid to late afternoon, depending on what season it is, it's then in much more shade. But nonetheless, it's still quite bright, but most particularly, it's very airy. There you go, plant lovers, we are back. So as you can see, I have it in a little wire noose, as it were, and it is hung on that lattice framework just above the fence. So it does get indirect light from behind, although that's south facing. It gets quite strong morning light, and then the polycarbonate roof gives it a protected but general wash of reasonably bright light. But I think the key is, because it's quite elevated, it's getting breeze from all directions because it's hanging on that lattice fence. So the breeze is surrounding it all the time. And with these type of orchids, I think that is quite important to get good airflow. So let's talk about temperature then. Firstly, given where these orchids come from, high altitudes, they do get cold winter nighttime minimums. And I actually just recently read that Holcoglossums can take a little bit of hoarfrost, so that very sort of gentle, slight frost that you'll get on leaves of plants, not a frost. So that is quite cool temperatures to have got to that stage. That will be below 0 centigrade and below 32 Fahrenheit. Not crazy freezing all the time, but cold nonetheless. And looking at that, you wouldn't really think that that orchid could take it. Seems it can. So here in Melbourne, we rarely get to 0 degrees centigrade or 32 degrees Fahrenheit here in the city. Very rarely. It usually, winter nighttime minimums hover at about 5 degrees centigrade. And that's around the 40 degree Fahrenheit. So cool. Quite cool, and perhaps a temperature you wouldn't think a lot of orchids would thrive at, but here we go. And then conversely, in summer, for us obviously, we can get quite high temperatures up into the 40s centigrade, which is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, not consistently, and it does tend to cool down at night, and our general summer maximums are not that extreme, but we certainly can have those peaks and troughs, and obviously summer is drier. But the clincher, which I've discovered, is that this orchid can just take those cold winter nighttime minimums and thrive outside. And look, it is such a healthy plant. So plant lovers, I am now committed to the Holcoglossum genus because I've only really just realized this, that they absolutely thrive in my conditions. So here is Exhibit A, and I must confess that I have just bought another one, which is hopefully winging its way, and I have my eye on a third. So the third one is a species that's all white, and the second one, the whole flower, is much more of a sort of a lilac-y blue, which looks amazing. Anyway, maybe I'll do a follow-up when they arrive. So temperature, there we go. It can take quite cool minimums and then reasonably high maximums. Water-wise then, as I said, it doesn't have a pseudobulb, so you do need to water it relatively frequently, particularly in summer, obviously, because it's going to dry out faster. So I've got a free draining mix. This is a really loose mix of medium-sized bark with a bit of perlite, bit of charcoal, and I actually do have some sphagnum moss mixed up in that just to help retain a bit of the moisture. But essentially, where it's hanging, I give it a bit of a squirt with the hose spray whenever I'm watering. So in summer that can be every day, and then in winter I just give it a spot water from a can because I don't want to be spraying water about everywhere in cold conditions. But you do need to water it all year, just obviously less often in winter, more often in summer, and let it dry out reasonably well between waterings. Food wise, fertilizer, like vandas and other monopodial orchids, because they don't really have huge root structures and they tend to be very epiphytic and sort of, you know, draping about, they do need a little bit more liquid food than perhaps you would give other orchids. So I try and liquid feed this maybe every third watering, and that can be a diluted solution of any sort of orchid-based fertilizer. I also can use sometimes fish emulsion base or a seaweed based one. I always mix it up because I think, like us, we all need a mixed diet. The key is to just dial the dilution down to about 1/8, 1/6 of what the packet recommends, because it's very easy to overdo it. Light then, as you saw from outside, mine gets quite strong morning light, then it gets diffused light, and as the day progresses it does get into slightly more shade. So it's fairly bright, indirect light all the time. If you imagine where it is, it's growing in these spaces in tree forks or in nooks in rocks. So it's going to get dappled light, a classic kind of epiphyte need, really. But I feel that it also does particularly well because it's higher up and it's getting quite bright indirect light all of the year, whereas other orchids in that growing space outside, depending on the season, the light really changes and they can sometimes be in much darker conditions at one season than the other, whereas this one is fairly consistently bright all year. Pot-wise then, so these do very well mounted on cork or board, whatever, but I can't really grow orchids like that here because our atmosphere I just feel is too dry. It's not humid enough. I have got actually a mounted orchid out there, but that was by accident and it was so stuck onto the mount that I just thought, oh, I'll have to give it a go. I packed lots of moss around it to try and keep it moist, but it's still alive and it's still growing leaves. Let's see. But there is always an alternative. So although this, like a vanda, would just do really well in a basket or mounted, mine is of course in a terracotta pot because I'm a terracotta pot kind of guy. Firstly, as we know, free draining. The terracotta itself evaporates water really quickly, and when you water it, it does pass through and enable it to evaporate quickly. Minus is that in summer, particularly for a plant like this with no pseudobulbs, everything is going to dry out really quickly. So in summer, I'd probably be watering this every day to make sure it doesn't dry out and completely frazzle. But wherever you are, you could use a basket, you could mount it, you could use plastic, and you could easily grow it indoors, I think, as long as you do have a bit of a cool differentiation in winter. It does, I think, need those cooler nighttime minimums, a bit like Phalaenopsis. And you need to have quite good air circulation, I feel. So if you can get those two things right inside, why not have a go at this? And then lastly, let's look at the flowering cycle. So we are now in mid-autumn in Australia. This spike appeared quite some months ago. It took a long time to open, but the flowers are quite long lasting. So I should get at least a month, 6 weeks of flower out of it, if not more, hopefully. And as you can see, not a huge plant. So I was quite surprised. I was kind of imagining it was going to be more vanda-like in terms of it really needs to mature and 3, 4, 5 years down the track till it blooms. I probably bought this about 18 months ago, year and a half ago, and longer actually, because it went through one whole winter outside and I was really nervous thinking it's going to die, but it didn't. And now we're heading towards the second winter of its life. So no, actually, yes, about 18 months. And it was a seedling, quite a small plant, but as you can see, it grew really quite well. I think it's doubled in length in a year and a half. And then it bloomed. So I have also read that they're quite slow to flower, but I'm here to disprove that because it wasn't big when I bought it. And there we have a very beautiful spike with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flowers. Obviously, perhaps as the plant gets bigger, you might get more blooms per spike and multiple spikes. I am not sure. I'm still very new to Holcoglossums. The other delight and joy is that, as you can see, a new plantlet has emerged at the bottom. which is going to be fantastic because maybe in a year that will be big enough to bloom and you have all these opportunities for multiple spikes. And then last but not least, look at that flower. Oh my goodness, it is so beautiful, so delicate. So the petals and sepals are this very, well, they're white with just a hint of lilac, and then this extraordinary lip with that magenta-y pink and the little orange highlights. Oh, they are so beautiful and very sort of elegant in their spaced outiness. They look very wing-like. Interesting, I wonder what pollinates it. Must be, white flowers in nature are often pollinated by nighttime flying beasts. So I wonder, maybe it's a moth that it looks like that it attracts. Either way, the flowers are just stunning, and I am here to tell you not an iota of fragrance. So it is definitely using its good looks to attract its pollinator, not its fragrance. And I haven't read anywhere that this is particularly fragrant, so I don't think I've just got a dud. I think perhaps it's just not a fragrant orchid. So it's an autumn flower, which is good because it's autumn right now. And then as you can see, the flower appears just in that little leaf bract there on the stem, and off you go. So you end up with a little green nub that starts to shoot out. And as you can see, the roots are quite silvery and a lot fatter. So it's not easy to confuse a flower spike for a root. But the flowers are just delicious, and I am so excited to find out that this whole genus will basically do really well in my conditions. So yes, let's watch as this obsession unfurls, but just look at them. Isn't it divine? So I'm here to tell you, in my conditions, super easy. It's just hung up on that lattice. To be honest, I often forget it. When I'm squirting the hose, it gets water. I try and mist it when it's ambiently quite dry, so there's more humid around it. I feed it when I remember. So to be honest, plant lovers, this is a bit of tough love because it's hanging up kind of out of sight, out of mind. But when it pings out with a bloom like that, it certainly brings itself back into focus. So anyway, there we are, Holcoglossum kimballianum, a great plant if, like me, you're in a coolish climate which has winters that don't particularly freeze or get below 0 degrees centigrade or 32 Fahrenheit often. So I think that's a lot of places. And I would even say that, say, in Britain, you could grow this in an unheated, cool greenhouse, and in parts of the States as well. Why not? Don't know how it goes in its tropical extreme, although those mountains are quite tropical, although they are cold at night. So who knows whether it's a tropic, an orchid that will do well in the tropics as well. But I don't care because I'm in a cool climate and this is just fabulous. So a whole raft of orchids for me to now explore and try and grow well. Anyway, plant lovers, thank you very much for watching. From Holcoglossum kimballianum and I, thank you for watching. Thanks for tuning in. I very much look forward to seeing you for my next adventure, whatever it might be. So until then, take care and I'll see you next week.